So today's presentation is based on a paper co-written with Amandine Catala and Pierre Poirier. It just got accepted at Sanchez for in a special issue on epistemology of neurodivergence and atypical cognition. So the starting point of our reflection is a paper by Jaswal and Akhtar published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences 2 years ago, in which they're challenging assumptions about social motivation in autism. Basically, they're going against a common belief based on differences in behaviors like hand flapping, rocking, echolalia, diminished eye contact, diminished demonstrative pointing in autistic population compared to a non-autistic population. And this belief is that these behaviors signal a lack of sociality. This kind of conception is further articulated in scientific theories like Chevalier's theory, social motivation theory of autism. For Chevalier's and other advocates of this position, autism is seen as an extreme case of diminished social motivation. So for instance, autistic person wouldn't find faces as salient as non-autistic individuals, or they would not be as interested, or they wouldn't find social relationship as rewarding as non-autistic individual. This third-person account of autism contrasts with a first-person account that you can find in biography of autistic individuals, like Gillian Drew, for instance, who says, you might have been told that people with autism do not want social or romantic relationship, but this is a myth, he says. While it is true that many of us struggle to create or maintain them, this does not mean that we do not want them, meaning social relationships. Likely, Ron Susskind says in his book, the way people see autistic folks is that they don't want to be around other people, but that's wrong. The truth about autistic people is that we want what everyone else wants. So we think that this contrast between the two approaches has a lot to teach about epistemic injustice, that is, injustice that affects individuals in their capacity as epistemic agents. We're also thinking that it has a lot to teach us about epistemic agency as well, which is the capacity to produce, transmit, or use knowledge. So I want to synthesize our point a bit before what we're going to defend in the paper, and I want to do it in a way a bit different that we do in the paper in order to make our point very salient, because I know that Zoom presentation it's very hard to stay concentrated and I want to be sure the message goes through. So in preparing this presentation, I reread a few papers. The paper has been written like long ago, and I reread Charles Mills' paper, and I think he does the point that is very similar to ours, or help at least eliminate the point that we're making. So he comments on the development of analytical epistemology in the 20th century. So he says, for a long period of the 20th century, epistemology has been Cartesian in a way, in that it was studying the knower in isolation, in a sort of void. He was by himself in a way. This got corrected by social epistemology, which look at the knower in interaction with others and in institution in which they are interacting, institutions like science or journalism. But Mills remarks that it is as if the social world is devoid is not taking into account the fact that relations between individuals are political, that people are occupying different positions in the social matrix. And this is what standpoint epistemologies or Marxist epistemology has been making more obvious. So he says, well, and this is where he gets to a point very similar to ours. He says, a corollary of standpoint epistemology is the idea of group-based cognitive handicap. if one group is privileged, after all, it must be by comparison with another group that is handicapped. So in the case of white, he says, some concepts or misconception or stereotypes are precluding vision of the reality. And further in the paper, he says, Black counter-testimony against the white mythology, which is this construction of a world which is out of touch with reality. He says, this counter-testimony has always existed, but originally have been, this Black counter-testimony has been handicapped by lack of material or cultural investment available for its production. So it has been transmitted through oral tradition, which has not been taken into account by whites. So if the first case or the first kind of handicap is not an epistemic injustice, the second case is, the first case produced epistemic injustice, but the second one, because this testimony was framed or expressed through orality, as well, because of that, it has not been taken into account. So this is kind of an epistemic injustice. So our point in the paper is that epistemic agency is relational, that agents operate in epistemic spaces which contain a number of things that can help or hinder their epistemic performances. And certain environment and the objects that it contains are epistemically disabling, while other are epistemically enabling. So we have to pay attention to the configuration and the content of those spaces if we want to understand and alleviate epistemic injustice. So here's my game plan today. I want to talk a bit about neuronormativity. So if you've seen Amanzin's presentation 2 weeks ago, you know what I'm going to be talking about. Then I'm going to suggest a different conception of agency, a relational conception of agency. Then I'll show how this conception of agency dovetail with a conception of disability that is being proposed by interactionist theorist, for instance. And if I have time, because I'm not sure I'm fitting into the 45-minute slot that has been given to me, I'll talk about strategies of enablement. Okay, so let's first start with the neuronormativity. In the paper, we suggest that neuronormativity is at the base or is the cause of epistemic injustice. So what is neuronormativity? It refers to the prevalent neurotypical set of assumptions, norms, or practices that construe neurotypicality as the sole acceptable or superior mode of cognition, and that stigmatizes attitudes, behaviors, or actions that reflect neuroatypical mode of cognition as deviant or inferior. So examples of those norms are norms concerning eye contact, posture, facial expression, prosody, conversational flow, etc. And these norms can be difficult to understand, sense, or apply by some individual with neurocognitive differences. So Larry and Donnellan has shown that some autistic children are able to carry a conversation, but they have very long delay in their response. So it takes like 14 seconds to reply to someone. And this is sometimes, this long lag of time is sometimes interpreted by neurotypical as lack of interest in a reply. Okay. So just to give you example of neuronormativity at work, I take quotes from Jacques Wall and Akhtar paper. So they say, an infant who is interested in people, but who, because of neurological condition, does not frequently smile, coo, or engage in frequent eye contact with her caregivers, will not get the same kind of opportunities in Western culture as one who does this behavior. They also, further in the paper, say ethnographic work has found that autistic sociality was often limited by interlocutors relying on standard ways of interacting, including face-to-face body alignment and insistence on speech. Also, this neuronormativity as being manifested in the fact that many differences are interpreted as deficits. So there's like motivation by neurotypical to make autistic people appear more like non-autistic, even if without paying attention or considering the fact that what we're trying to change is maybe adaptive, maybe meaningful. So there's been, and this can be very frustrating for autistic individuals. So there's therapies who are trying to make echolalia or stereotype behavior disappear without thinking that maybe these behaviors mean something. So those norms are at work, but they're also obvious to autistic individuals. So there's a phenomena that has been described more and more lately of social camouflage, which social camouflage is basically trying to pass for neurotypical, hiding your differences. And in social camouflage, sometimes people are trying not to convey some of the stuff that they are feeling or the way that they are feeling. So this is from All and others in 2017. These are from interview with autistic individuals. So one says, I say as little as possible about myself, and as more I say, the more likely it is, the more likely it is that I say something inappropriate, or I remain silent as another when I might otherwise have spoken, knowing that I can't always tell whether or not my comments will be welcome. Or finally, I do not talk about anything of interest to me. I avoid talking much and just pretend to be interested in what people are saying. Okay, so these norms are obvious. They're trying, maybe not that obvious, but they're seen, they're felt by autistic individual, but it seems like neurotypical do not perceive them. And this leads them to produce third personal narratives that locate the source of these difficulty in autistic persons rather than in the normative set of assumption, norms, and practices. To follow Charles Mills is called, we call this, following Charles Mills, neurotypical ignorance. So Charles Mills described a racial ignorance, and he was saying members of dominant social groups typically do not experience their own privileged position. We could call that subjective ignorance, nor do they understand the world, that the world is unjustly structured, which we call objective ignorance. This kind of ignorance is not a passive ignorance. It's not because you've not been exposed to certain things. It's active. It's an active process. There's something that is blocking the learning of this reality. So Medina in his paper says, in a paper says, learning is resisted and blocked in a number of different ways. And one of this way is through preconceptions that gets in the way of seeing things in a different way. So neuronormativity plays a crucial role in the production, or this is what we want to claim, play a crucial role in the production of epistemic injustice. Neurotypicals, including scientific researchers working on autism, are ignorant of the role of neuronormativity. Their perception of reality is obstructed also by inadequate conception of autism, and this ignorance leads them to situate the source of the problem encountered by neurotypical inside them. So we said, I first defend the idea that neurotypicality or neuronormativity is the cause of epistemic injustice. What kind of epistemic injustice are we finding in the case that we're just described? Well, there's many of these epistemic injustice. If you're familiar with the literature, I'm not going to bore you with that, but there's like two grand families of epistemic injustice: testimonial, which affect the credibility of agents, and hermeneutical injustice, which affect the intelligibility of agents. So the one that we're identified in the case described earlier are systematic epistemic injustice. For instance, epistemic injustice sometimes happens between two individuals, but sometimes they're between an institution or a discipline and a group of people. In that case of interest, it's between neuroscientists or psychologists and autistic individuals. Sometimes injustice are preemptive in the sense that the testimony of a group would just not be used at all. A group would be considered as, to use Doston's expression, epistemologically dead. You're not taking into account at all what they have to say about something. There's also a form of epistemic injustice that Doston mentioned, which is smothering. We've seen with camouflage, social camouflage, that some individuals prefer not to talk about their experience. So this generates an injustice in a way. The other family of injustice are, for instance, hermeneutical, but contributive injustice. In contributive injustice, a subgroup or a marginalized group have a concept, but this concept does not spread into the whole population. So it stays inside this subgroup for different kind of reasons. Another kind of epistemic injustice is expressive injustice. For instance, this affects not the content of what is said, but the form used to say that thing. For instance, if you're not using, as Mills was saying, not using written testimony, if you're not doing a written testimony, you might not be considered, or your testimony might not be considered. What is important is to see that different kinds of injustice interact with each other. So if you're not considered as an epistemological agent, if you're preempt of your testimony, you cannot contribute to hermeneutical resources. So the concepts that you're having, this different concept, cannot spread into the population. Also, if you're using a disvalued way of expressing yourself, you might this might stain in a way your contribution, and you might be disvalued as agent because you're using a disvalued way of expression. So our thesis in the paper is that these injustices that we just talked about are caused by neuronormativity, and that we want to explain the mechanism through which it goes. Okay, so in order to do that, we have to go through a different conception of agency, a relation conception of agency. This position has historical antecedents in Wittgenstein, in Ryle, for instance, which describe action and other mental different kinds of mental states as depending on norms on a form of life, for instance. So if you want to know what this agent is doing, you don't look in her head, but you have to learn the rules of signaling in bicycle, for instance. This kind of epistemology and conception of agency is contrasting with the one that is dominant in the field, which is the mediational epistemology, sometimes called also the sandwich model of the mind. This model, think of cognition as the manipulation of internal representation, and think of cognition as isolated from perception and action. So epistemic agency in this model is internalist in many ways. First, the capacities, the epistemological capacities of the agents are internal. Second, the source of action and the agent goals are internal as well. They are beliefs, desires, and intention. And the goals objects are internal as well. They are true propositions, for instance. And a consequence of this model is that cognition or epistemic agency can be studied in isolation of the world in which it takes place. Breaking free from this picture is a model that is gaining momentum in the last few years in activism. In this program, Varela, one of his most vocal advocates for a long time, says We explicitly call into question the assumption that cognition consists of the representation of a world that is independent of our perceptual or cognitive capacity by a cognitive system that exists independent of the world. So it goes against this mediational epistemology. Cognition in this model does not consist uniquely in the manipulation of representation that express propositions, and knowledge is not a set of true belief. They are rather forms of engaged involvement with the world in service of action and survival. So cognition, cognition and the mind is in life. The kind of inactivism that we want to defend is pretty much middle of the road in activism. It tries to ground the theory is grounded in a characterization of the living. So living systems are thought as autonomous systems who are operationally closed network of enabling relations. So what is an enabling relation? And this is important to understand what follows. But here in the case of the fridge, the electricity is enabling the exercise of the process that is the fridge keeping your stuff cold in a way. So electricity enabled the fridge to carry on its tasks. So an autonomous system is a system composed of processes that generate and sustain that system as a unity. And this is the important part, in such a system, every constituent process is conditioned by some other process in the system. So here, the circles are processes and the arrows are enabling relations. So you see that for certain of those circles, they are connected with each other, so they are co-enabling in a way. I'm going to explain this idea. Basically, what it means is that since they are co-enabling, they form a system, and there's other enabling conditions that are outside the system. So, for instance, the sun might be necessary for the plant to grow, but the sun doesn't need the plant in a way. So the enabling relation is asymmetrical. Here in a living system, they are symmetrical. So to give you the example of the cell, the membrane allows the autocatalytic processes to take place by fencing in a way the space, so those processes will find material to go on. And the autocatalytic processes allows the production and maintenance of the membrane by producing, for instance, proteins and stuff like that that will change the cytoarchitecture of the cell. In living systems, the equilibrium between those processes are precarious. So if one breaks, the other one won't be able to go on. They're depending also of exchanges with the world for food, for energy, for instance. So to survive, the cell has to be dynamically coupled with the world, which means this is one of the feature of living, but the other one is adaptivity. So the adaptivity entails that living systems are robust. They can withstand perturbations by undergoing inside and outside regulatory activities. So basically modifications of the environment are reflected in the organism and vice versa. For example, a cell, a bacteria might be searching for conditions that are conducive for its survival and avoiding conditions that are detrimental to it. So such a system has a perspective on the world. Certain things are good for it, other things are bad. Action as well can be good if they promote survival and bad if they're detrimental to its survival. So it's the introduction of some sort of basic normativity in the world. These things that are good or bad, that are valued or disvalued, create or change the physical environment or the environment into a niche of, or what we call a landscape of affordances. So It transforms the environment in things that are valued or disvalued on which the agent can act upon. And these action and these values depend on different abilities of the organism, as well as the demands or concerns of that creature. So basically, it transformed the neutral environment into a landscape of affordances. So these landscape of affordances are relative to a population. It's as Gallagher puts it, the total ensemble of available affordances for a population relative to a form of life. So it may be that for the whole population, mountains are something we can climb, so it's an affordance, but not all of us can climb the mountain. So it's part of the landscape of affordance, but we only occupy a subfield of that, or some subspace of that landscape of affordances. This landscape is physical, but it's also for human social. We interact with other people. Other people are affording us some action. They're affording us something more. They're affording something that we might call participatory sensemaking. You know, these people who are, Miles Davis, Coltrane, are people that are interacting to make sense. So you can see also science as a participatory sense-making enterprise. So the sense-making is the concepts are produced through the interactions of the different individual. But our environment is not only as we find it. It is also the result of construction of our activity. So we do some what's called niche construction in order to extend or facilitate some of our actions. In that case, for instance, we construct a staircase so we can climb a hill, which would be more difficult to climb, especially when it's raining. So it's going to be easier. We're not only constructing our physical environment, but also our epistemological environment. So Sterling in his 2003 talks about us as epistemic engineer. So we create tools, research engine, symbols that help us or extend our ability. And we create facilities like schools where we can learn how to use those tools more efficiently. Among those tools, epistemic tools that we create, are mental institutions. The term, I know when we're talking in a psychiatry crowd, it feels like a bit strange, but hey, I didn't create the term. It has been proposed by Gallagher and Krif Safi. It designates the rich networks of norm-governed practices, artifacts, and traditions that shape how we attempt to and interact with the world and other, and which furnish access to novel abilities or features of the world otherwise beyond our reach. So take written language. Learning to read changed the landscape of affordance. So suddenly the thing that is on the right of the screen is not only something that you put in your boots when they're wet to dry them, it becomes something that you can use to get information about the world. To do that, you have to internalize norms like syntax rules. You have also to acquire beliefs. For instance, what is the appropriate language to be used in such a thing? What is the meaning of certain words? You need also to internalize practices, expectations. So what do I expect from, like, let's say, the Sunday edition of the Time? There's going to be stuff that is not in other editions. And you have to acquire also low-level body habits. These are pretty obvious when you start reading. If you're like me and you're not very good at, you don't read manga so much, your habits of reading are a challenge in a way. Well, at one point, it always happens to me, I don't know in which direction I should read the frames. So these are manifestation of our habits of low-level body habits, the scanning we do, the direction in which our eyes are going. So some mental institutions are not accessible to others. So if law is a mental institution, only lawyers can navigate it properly. Now that we've characterized the environment, let's come back to the agents. So autonomous systems are agents when they can adaptively modulate their coupling with the environment. So here's a case of coupling here. For instance, those gazelle, I think they're gazelles, I'm not sure, maybe antelopes, I don't know, display a very curious behavior. Instead of flying from the big cat there, they're approaching him. They stay at distance, but they're approaching him. Sterling says that this is some kind of epistemic action, which goal is to reduce the informational opacity of the environment. So basically, it's better to keep this big guy to know where he is than having this guy in the back there in the bush, not knowing where he is. So it's a good idea to do so by approaching him. You get information about his position, and it has an effect on your survival. So in that case, modulation is adaptive because it contributes to the maintenance of the system autonomy. You don't get eaten by the guy. So knowledge in this model is first and foremost something we do. We modulate the dynamic coupling to achieve and improve our pre-reflexive understanding. Think of what you're doing when you arrive in a city that you don't know and you have to go to a conference taking the public transportation. You first start by reading about the system. You look at a map, you look where you need to go. But as the day goes by, you start noticing landmarks. You start knowing the practices in that country. You start to learn what you can do, what you can't do, how you should stand before, and who you should look for if you're lost and if you need advice and stuff like that. So this is the kind of, this is not propositional knowledge. This is a mix of propositional and know-how that is non-propositional. So now that we've been talking about that, the form of knowledge, we can talk about the subject that is of interest to us. So Kruger and Maese in a recent paper have been arguing that there is something called a neurotypical mental institution, which for them is an affordance landscape with which many individuals can learn to skillfully interact by moving through the environment, and with which they can modulate their dynamic coupling to acquire knowledge regarding the beliefs and intention of other individuals. So just to come back to this, sorry, I lost my, just to come back, you remember this quote that I mentioned at the beginning. So kids that are not interacting with, who are interacting differently with their caregivers are not given the same social opportunity. So caregiver won't use prosody, won't name objects when they're looking at the same objects. So there are stuff that they won't learn. And if you buy Cecilia A's theories about the way we develop high-level cognitive ability, like over-imitation, for instance, well, you'll see that there's some stuff that you won't be able to acquire just because you don't navigate this environment the same way others are doing it. So this institution depends on traits that are shared by individual in many cultures, like gaze cueing to direct attention, but that are not necessarily shared by all. The institution can be thought about as global. So the idea of directing attention with eye gaze seems to be culturally widespread, but they can also be more local. So you have rules about how to behave or interpret behavior in schools, gyms, parks, or restaurants, and even different kinds of restaurants. So these mental institutions are epistemically important because they help disambiguate the actions taken by others and understanding them. Because these mental institutions do not always wear their identity on their sleeve, you need you need to be aware of the way that they are announced in a way. So the identification of the norms and the expectation they enforce are conveyed oftentimes by very fine-grained nuance in tone of voice, facial expression, posture, and other forms of bodily language. So in very fancy restaurant, for instance, it's the attitude of the waiter that will tell you that you took the wrong spoon, for instance. You shouldn't have taken the small spoon for eating your soup. That's not something you're done. Don't expect that in a greasy spoon, probably, although I experienced that also. But so this, you get like these information that are conveyed by body posture that are very hard. If you don't pay attention to them, you cannot get this information about the expectations that are put on you. If the story is right, the disability of autistic persons is not caused by an inherent property, but by the fact that they navigate an affordance landscape set by neurotypical mental institution that is being built for a typical mind. In those environments, they are, that's what we want to argue, disabled. In order to understand the idea that we want to put forward in the paper, I have to go back to different kinds or different families of theory of disability. If you're familiar with the literature on disability, you know that there's like three big families of theory. The medical model of disability puts the source of disability inside the individual. The impairment is the cause of the disability. The social model put the source of disability in the social world. So someone might have an impairment, but an impairment is not a disability. It becomes a disability when the society or the environment is not adapted to the person. This social model has been, we have sympathy for this model and we're very close to this model, but some people have been criticized the model for its overemphasis for its overemphasis of the social factors and to the fact that it forgets to take into account the physical factors or the feature of the individual. So that's what the interactionist model does, and that's why we have more sympathy for this model. So the interactionist model has been defended by multiple people, but it is the model that has been taken by the World Health Organization in its ICF, its International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health. For them, so it's the function of this book is to measure functionality of different people, and problem with functionality can be caused by health condition, but also by environmental factors, personal factor, and the interaction of all these factors together. One very important distinction in this model is the distinction between capacity and performance. So capacity is sometimes referred as the naked person assessment. So the capacity is measured in sort of an idealized environment or a statistically normal environment. So the environment that you are most likely to be in. And performance is the measure of your actual performance or the exercise of this capacity. So it's possible that you have a capacity, but you're not able to perform because of things in your environment. It's also possible that you don't have, or your capacity is not as is decreased, but you're able to perform because they're enabling factor in your environment. So just to give you an example, here's a paper from Clark and George, who are in this tradition of disablement and enablement. What they're arguing about is that some built environments, some neighborhoods that are densely constructed and varied in their different services that they offer are enabling, that is, that for old folks, they stay functional longer in these kinds of environment, in contrast with suburbs, for instance, which are usually not very densely populated and not varied. Okay, so they are disabling and enabling factors, and amongst those factors, there are disabling factors are cultural norms or the presence of institutions that cannot accommodate diversity. I'm not going to read that, but so the interaction, as we want to argue, the interactionist model dovetails with the model of agency defended by us in the previous section. The performance of certain functions, in the case of the ICF, it's activity or participation, is the result of a dynamic interaction between an agent's skills and its physical feature and the features afforded by their environment. The social institution respond and cater only to, and the one that we mentioned, the neurotypical environment, mental institution, respond and cater only to a subset of human variability. So the presence or absence of certain affordances in the environment become an important source of disability. And because we're talking about enablement and disablement, we're talking about a process, and this process is reversible by modifying the factors that disable or enable an individual. So we reject a neurocentric conception of epistemic agency, which places epistemic agency or understand epistemic agency as depending only of a specific set of cognitive capacity. We advocate for an inactive conception, where agency depends on feature of the brain and the body, as well as feature of the epistemic environment. Epistemic injustice are cases where epistemic agency cannot manifest itself because affordances are lacking or maladapted, but also because they contain obstacles or barriers, what we call epistemic disaffordances. So neurotypical mental institutions can be epistemically disabling autistic person for two reasons. First, because they cannot expect normal epistemic interaction, both because they cannot exploit the affordances offered by neurotypicals, and two, because of their particular practices or their differences lead to their exclusion in epistemic interactions. The second reason is that it is because they also live in a world that contain epistemic disaffordances like researchers' biases, beliefs, or scientific conceptions about autism. This leads to impoverished epistemological interaction and asymmetrical forms of participatory sense-making in the science, at least, where their opinion is not asked or their point of view is not inquired about. Okay, I don't know where I am in time. Sarah.
So you would have 5 minutes?
That's fine, it's more than enough. Okay, so we've been talking about disablement. In the last part of this paper, I'm going to suggest a few ways in which I'm going to suggest a few strategies of epistemic enablement. So there has been called in the literature in reaction to what has been called a deficit in theory of minds, implying here that there are different kinds of minds and that some neurotypical just have a theory of one mind, one kind of mind. So there have been calls for neurotypical researchers to think outside the normative box or to adopt a form of neurocosmopolitism. And we think that this attitude is consubstantial to an activism with its preoccupation with sense-making and adaptation. So we think that of an activism as a form of enabling in a way. So an activism demands that we pay attention to the possibility that certain behaviors that look like being dysfunctional or non-functional are in fact non-standard adaptive responses because the different set of abilities and concern of individual and the peculiarity and the effect it has on its affordance landscape. So for instance, echolalia can be seen as a way to communicate frustration and emotion. Maybe not always, but some researchers are suggesting that sometimes it is used in this way. So it's an adaptive response to the environment. Self-stims also, and flapping, figure slapping, or shutdowns can also be seen as ways to occlude signal noise or downregulate anxiety. So we think that in activism, open our or leads us to suspend our judgment about the functionality and non-functionality of behaviors, but also allow us to be more open to the possibility that these are adaptive behaviors. I'm just going to skip this one. Another enabling strategy is participative research. Phoebe, in her presentation, talked a bit about that. And there's been numerous calls in the last few years to integrate autistic persons in the process of research. And there are different types of participatory or participative research with different level of implication for each. For instance, here's a sort of like the spectrum of implication. And from the second on, you can see that there's a common preoccupation for this kind of research to integrate the point of view of autistic individual in the research. And in the case of autism, this kind of research has led to the re-evaluation of traditional conceptions. In the case of social motivation, I think we should have, if we had listened, we should have reevaluated the theory earlier. But it has led to change in emphasis to feature of the condition that were neglected before by theory, like the theory of mind model of people like Baron Cohen. So that led to the recognition of the importance of sensory motor differences between autistic and non-autistic individuals. One last strategy is that is a strategy that people who are doing this kind of research had to take, which is adapt the environment of the research they're doing. So there's been changes in language in the research, the fact to rely or change of the type of language that is used, modification of the physical space, for instance, the lighting, the noise around the people, use of written language instead of speech to answer questions. So accommodation or change in the environment so it would be more friendly to diversity. There's also a methodological challenge, which is to give a voice to non-linguistic children or people who have difficulty to use the language. So Godion, she's a designer of environment, and she works with autistic adults, and she says, well, up to now, we've been working a lot with verbal autistic adults, and we never took into consideration the point of view of adults, autistic adults who have limitation with language. And she says, well, and she proposed to take into account their point of view in building environment by, for instance, doing things like that, which is doing a visual version of a written test, which tests the sensory profile of the individual, the kind of things that they like to touch, the texture that they like, etc., etc. So there's things in that direction that are, I think, very enabling for and would bring more justice, epistemological justice. So in conclusion, we identified in the paper neuronormativity as a source of epistemic injustice for autistic persons. We also proposed to adopt a dynamical and relational model of agency. In line with the interactionist model of disability, we argue that disablement is a result of the process. And we propose to conceive of epistemic injustice as the result of a disablement process caused by maladapted affordances and disaffordances. And we introduce the idea of epistemic enabling and propose ways to improve epistemic justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luc. Thank you. So maybe you can unshare your screen if you want to see everyone. We are now going to take the questions. So as usual, if you can write your name or anything in the chat, I'll allow you to ask your question to Luc. Okay, so Justin Garson to start. Are you? Yeah.
Hi, Justin.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Luc. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this talk, and it just gave me so much to think about. And I'd certainly like to read through some of the, a lot of those references that you mentioned. I guess this was a question that I kind of had 2 weeks ago when Amandine spoke, and I'm wondering what you think of this. I guess I'm inclined to sympathize with Jerome Wakefield's point of view, only to a certain extent, namely that the notion of function and dysfunction is a objective notion. It doesn't involve value judgments. Whether or not somebody's brain is functional or dysfunctional, doesn't have to do with when anybody, it doesn't have to do with our values. It's just a fact about whether it can do pretty much what it evolved to do. And I'm wondering whether that stance is compatible. So if you ask somebody like me, do you think that there are forms of autism that stem from a biological dysfunction in the brain? I would say, well, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'd love to know. I'd love to know more. I hope we find out someday. Do you think that stance is compatible with what you're talking about, recognizing that society is unjustly structured, being committed to restructuring our epistemic practices in such a way as to be more inclusive? Do you know what I mean? Do those two stances fit together?
Well, in a way, I think, well, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. In a way, we're talking from somewhere else. The same way that our point is about function and epistemic functioning in a way. So you want to be able to contribute to let's say, building epistemological or hermeneutical resources. The idea is that for different reasons, so it might be a dysfunction, it might be a disorder, it might be an impairment, it might be peculiarities of your cognition, or a way that you're built that is different. So, and different of this, you cannot make a contribution to this hermetic, to those concepts. There's an obstacle to your to that kind of interaction. So in a way, you can characterize autism as a dysfunction, and it would do the same thing. The thing is that you're not able to interact. There's an injustice in the sense that your point of view is not taken into account. So you see where it's quite compatible, but in another sense, it's not the subject of the day. In a way, it's right. It's different. It's a different topic. So I don't think in the paper we're claiming that autistic persons are dysfunctional in in the term that Jerry's would use, that they have a mental condition or not. It can be different. So this is like something that is that we're not touching. What we're touching is that they're affected by an epistemic injustice, and the reason why they're like that, it's because the environment in a way is not allowing them to perform equally, in a sense. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we're not I don't think we're taking, maybe Amandine will tell me, but I don't think we're taking a stance on that.
Interesting. All right, yeah. Thank you.
Welcome.
So next question is from Camilo Enrique Sanchez. You should be able to unmute your... Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to know if you find any relevance, bearing in mind the concept of an activist agency and also the some of the enabling strategies that you mentioned, do you find any relevancy for the temporal experience of time, maybe in autistic individuals, maybe in the social context of them, the interactive relation between them?
I'm not sure. Is it? Are you alluding to the fact that maybe the flow is not the same, or are you talking about like a different
Yes.
experience of time?
Yes. I'm thinking about some conceptions where synchronicity is relevant, dealing with the psychopathology experience or
Yeah. Well,
psychopathological experience.
yeah, that's part of the what we call the neurotypical norms or the neuronormativity. So this synchronicity is something that we're expect basically. If you're neurotypical, you expect people to react in at a certain frequency, at a certain speed, and if these norms are broken, we tend to assume that the problem is in the person basically, and it's not that like we stop interacting and attribute him a problem. Well, in a way, the problem is the difference here are assumed to be are sort of like are considered as norms in a way. So these differences, I thought that maybe you were alluding to the fact that there's a different experience of time. So some phenomenologists characterize depression, for instance, or depressive as having a different experience of time, where time is sort of like closed. They live in the present that repeats itself without future ahead or without horizon or something like that. But it's not what you're talking about. It's more like the synchrony.
No. I'm also talking about what you're referring to, phenomenological approaches of the importance of temporal experience.
Yeah, that I have no clue. I don't. We haven't. It's something that we should look into for sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question.
Thank you. So next question is from Natalie Washington.
Hey, Natalia.
Hey, Luc, how are you? Thank you very much for your talk. Perhaps,
yeah, welcome.
Unsurprisingly, I'm on board with almost everything you say, and maybe this is a good follow-up to Camilo's question, because I was wondering about what you said in light of some of what we heard from Mohammed Rashed maybe a month ago, with regard to like clinical understanding in the encounter with a person who has radically different or neuroatypical style of thinking. I'm wondering, maybe one way of asking this is about science communication. Like if we take this interactionist perspective on board, how do we communicate to the general public that they need to be more conscious of differences in thinking? Or, and this is maybe the real worry, the lesson that we should draw as researchers, like how capable do you think people are going to be of that down the line?
Yeah, well, that's you know, this paper is written in. We got a grant for 5 years. I think we're going to spend 5 years asking ourselves these kinds of questions. But we're, you know, there's like different ways. I don't know if I'm going to reply exactly to the question, and you don't be shy to ask me if I don't. But there's like different ways of raising consciousness about these things. Some of them would be through, like, let's say, comic books, or, you know, I was thinking sometimes books are doing the job. So I was reading Convenience Store Woman, I think, from a Japanese author, and she found herself sort of like a space of affordance in convenience store, where everything is formatted. Interactions are formatted. She knows what she has to say. She knows what she has to do. So she said, the interactions are they're all defined, and she thrives in that environment. So, you know, these kinds of things are helping, but true, not everyone will change their way of seeing things, but as the more you give the voice to the people who are, you know, who are living in those conditions, the more likely it is that the ways of communicating this will get through. People will get through this. I think change in society lately has been showing that, you know, this can happen, and this happens frequently. Our attitudes are changing to our marginalized group, and it could be, you know, so we're exploring the different ways. We have also something, we're going to do something on comics, for instance. I think comics are more accessible than a novel for many people, and they're allowing also things that you cannot do in a novel. For instance, presenting two ideas at the same time, or presenting what's happening in the head of someone while he's interacting with someone else. So movie pictures, as much as they can do damage, they can also do good. So I basically have no precise answer to your question, but I can just be hopeful and hope that this is going to change.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Amandine Catala has written in the chat that for a great example of epistemic justice for autistic people, there's this wonderful website, Ask Me Girl, and also we can see Invisible Differences by Julie Dachez. Thank you, Amandine. Any other questions or comments for Luc? I think everyone is respecting Anne-Marie's time and and Luc's future work today. Yeah. We would have time for another question, but if yes, Rosa Ritunano.
Hi, Rosa.
Yeah, hi. So sorry for being late at the last minute. I was just wondering something that it might be a very boring question, but something you said at the very beginning about you know, this very stark contrast between third person and first person experience, which I kind of, it resonates a lot with me. I'm a psychiatrist, and I find that most of psychiatric definitions of mental states or mental symptoms, I don't know if it's because they try to be objective, but they really, really like are completely blind to what is the first person experience. And I wonder, what is your view as to what is doing the work there, and how did we get to this point? And what I mean is, so you said about like assuming that their behavior, because they're behaving the way they do, that means lack of sociality, but actually the first person experience is very different. So what is doing the work there? Is that the assumption that whatever they're saying is irrational and they're not being believed just on the basis of their behavior, or is it the apparent unintelligibility? So why is their testimony completely been shut down?
Yeah,
is that stigma?
Yeah.
Like what is it?
Yeah, I was asking myself the same question, and I guess it's not one factor, but many factors. One is that sometimes you don't even bother to ask people how they feel about something. So you characterize them. Historically, there's been this posture, you would say, of science characterizing a condition from the outside, looking at objective features that you can use to diagnose someone. And this way of doing was without taking into account what people are experiencing. So I think for schizophrenia, for instance, I know that, well, I'm not, I'll come back to that. But so one is you don't bother to ask. The second one is something that is mentioned sometimes is that you cannot take into account what people are saying about their own condition. So there's this suspicion that introspection is not reliable. And this is something we carried from behaviorism, but also in cognitive science, where it's not believed that people have really direct access to their state of mind. It's worse even with if you're adopting a theory of mind model of autism, because your own characterization of the events of your mental life are captured with a theory that, or without the theory that people are usually using. So it goes somehow, you cannot report on those events. And you see like, people like Temple Grandin, for instance, it seemed like sometimes she's describing her own mental life using, for instance, referring to her IDs as pictures, for instance, as if she's sort of like reconstructing a theory of mind that she wouldn't have. I mean, this is just like what some people would interpret their behavior being like that. Otherwise, it's also what you mentioned. So that's another factor where, in the particular case of autism, different theories will have an impact on on the credibility of the agent there. And finally, I think true, certain behaviors are considered sufficient proof of if someone is rocking in front of you and not responding to you, not looking you in the eyes, one maybe natural interpretation for someone who's neurotypical is that they don't want to interact. So why, it seemed like behavior is enough to conclude about that, and not, and then not bother to ask people how they feel. And if you can also read the reply to the paper, it's in brain and behavioral and brain sciences, and there's like a bunch of replies, and you'll see that some people stick to their view and try to say, well, okay, they're social, but then social doesn't mean the same things for the same thing for them. For instance, they're looking for something else. Friendship is not the same thing for autistic individuals, and they seem like to find ad hoc sort of like ad hoc moves to keep their theories, and then you feel like there's some effective reasons why they're keeping their theories, and then I don't want to speculate about the reason. But you're right, we have to isolate the factors that makes it so hard for this view to come true, and for autistic individuals to be heard.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really interesting. And it applies across disorders and
I think so too.
And I think it's creating such a huge conceptual mismatch between what people think they're measuring objectively and what the actual experience is. And that creates obviously a cascade of other problems for empirical science and all that.
Yeah,
so,
and it's and it's something that like the RDoC, the RDOC, the initiative from the National Institute of Mental Health was trying to cure in a way with his project on schizophrenia, where certain symptoms are not represented in the diagnostic, in the DSM, for instance. So nobody sort of like is interested by them. So if you're having executive problems, for instance, if you have problem of attention and you're schizophrenic, your problem won't be object of the cure or the therapy, because it's not mentioned as a defining symptom of schizophrenia. So there was like a lack of study of those aspects of the experience or the cognition of a class of individuals who were understudied because they were not mentioned in the book, in the Bible. So I think this can, giving the voice to the patient can help remedy that too. In fact, yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
We would have a question from Daniel Mosseli. Are you here?
Yes. Daniel? Yeah. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Luc. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I had sort of an epistemological question about, so it seemed that within this inactivist framework that you're proposing, it's very hard to sort of pin down norms and knowing what norms are. You mentioned that a lawyer, to understand that the norms of law, you need to be essentially a lawyer to understand them. And I was sort of wondering, in more informal contexts, how do we know what neurotypical norms are? Because it seems very important, you know, if you want to make this analogy between sort of Marxist standpoint theory that wants to focus on class divisions, or on Mill's work on race, looking at sort of dominant ethnic or racial groups in a society. If there's a sort of dominant neuro class, I guess I'm sort of wondering how to, I know this language is very familiar in literature, but I still sort of wondering what it really means to articulate what neurotypical norms are.
Well, they are, I think, I'm not sure. The idea is that those norms are revealed by, you know, when they're broken in a way. So you see them at work when somebody does not follow them, when people are not aligning their body properly, when they're not imitating you. For instance, you know, these things when you're imitating someone, conversing with them, you take the same posture. Things like that are, you know, norms of the thing is that the inactivist model thinks of knowledge as being this kind of thing, you know, this not necessarily articulated norms, norms that you could spell out, but norms that you feel, that you're experiencing, and people who are not aligning with those norms are felt or excluded. So basically they are revealed in those moments. The norms are revealed in those moments.
But are these norms anything different than just cultural norms? And it seems, well, that, you know, we have standards of cultural appropriateness that one can use. And when we see someone not responding quickly or not making eye contact or reading Shakespeare at 13, you know, these might be sort of not appropriate within a certain type of culture, but I'm wondering how neurotypicality comes in.
Yeah, it's well, as I said, it's both those very global norms that are norms of interaction, norms that are largely shared, but they might be a difference in cultures. For instance, the use of touch to indicate attention in certain cultures is more used than the eye gaze, for instance. So people will take your hand and put it there so to attract your attention on the thing. So yeah, those norms are changing, but they're using very subtle cues that are like eye gaze and stuff like that, but they're more global. But then you get also the very local norms, like the norms, academic norms, for instance, or restaurants. You know, there's stuff that you do in a greasy spoon that you wouldn't do in a fancy restaurant, but you have to be able to recognize that. And one way we give that information is by, well, sometimes we do it explicitly, but oftentimes we do it using our body language, our posture, the intonation of our voice. And if you're not paying attention to that, or if you can't take that into account, then you cannot know what the norms are. So those are sort of like norms that we're using to carry the information and disambiguate what expectations are and what the norms are in the particular setting. So these are the norms that I'm talking about, more than the more local, you know, eating with your little spoon, eating your dessert with the little spoon. But the way that we're giving that information is through signals that and norms that we have to follow. And you have to understand now, let's say I'm in a restaurant and I'm saying to you, I don't know, you know, there's many spoons you can use for eating, and some are proper, some are improper. So here you have to, understand that by the tone of my voice, I'm giving you I'm making allusion to what you're doing. So these are the norms that I'm talking about or more interested by.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question also.
Thank you
So,
very much.
yeah.
You were going to say something, Luc?
No, we have to go. There's a defense.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
going to be time for the defense, and there is a note in the chat. So I invite you all to, if you want, you can actually save the chat, and Luc, you can also access it. But yes, I think we are gonna have to finish the session today. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Luc, too. And in 2 weeks, we will hear Justin Garson. So please don't forget to register on our website. It's on May 13th. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.